All right, everyone, welcome to the first screencast for Chapter 11. We're going to have two screencasts for this chapter. So what is monopolistic competition? Well, it's a market structure that's characterized by three things: free entry, many different firms, product differentiation. What do we mean by product differentiation? Well, you may remember in the perfect competition market, we assumed that all the goods were the same for a firm, so that consumers didn't really care which firm they bought a particular good from because they viewed them as homogeneous, as always being the same. Well, in a monopolistically competitive model of a firm, firms have used some process in order to make their goods stand out from someone else's good. And they can do that in several different ways that we'll talk about in this screencast. Here's a little table that I put together to basically give you the differences between perfectly competitive markets, monopolistic competition, and monopoly. So perfectly competitive markets have many sellers, monopolistic competition has many sellers, and monopoly only has one seller. In similar products in a perfectly competitive market, differentiated products in monopolistic competition, and in monopoly they have a unique product. They're the only firm that sells that particular product. Monopolistic competition and perfectly competitive markets are similar in that they both have free entry and free exit. So what we're going to see in this screencast, in this chapter, is a sort of hybrid between the two markets that we've talked about previously. All right, so what is product differentiation? Well, it could be the style or type of a good. So it could be clothing stores try to differentiate themselves from one another. Different food operators at a food court at a mall try to convince you of different types of food that you may be differentiated from one another. Also, location is a big way that products can be differentiated. Gas stations, dry cleaners, barbershops, they all differentiate themselves by being more convenient to you, more local to where you are. Another way that product differentiation happens is with quality. You can have high-end restaurants and low-end restaurants. And then there's this middle area called fast casual that is becoming very popular now, that kind of tries to find a place in between fast food and sit-down dining restaurants. But Taco Bell versus Baja Fresh, Subway versus Quiznos, Subway versus Ike's Love and Sandwiches downtown here. Ike's Love and Sandwiches has a sign that says you're worth more than $4 or $5 or whatever the Subway footlong deal is. Basically, they're trying to differentiate themselves as a higher-end producer of sandwiches. There can also be trade-offs in terms of product differentiation. Lower quality, lower prices, you may get faster service. Higher quality, higher prices may have slower service. So that's another way that products try to differentiate themselves, by speed. 30 minutes or less was the famous pizza delivery promise years back by Domino's. So that's another way that firms try to differentiate themselves. So in the rest of this screencast, what we're going to try to do is we're going to look at monopolistic competition both in the short run and in the long run. And so we're going to think about how we did that with perfect competition. We thought about, well, here's a firm that is at where the market's at equilibrium and they're price takers and there's no profit in the long run. And then something happens, and that caused firms to respond in different ways. We're going to do the same sort of thing, but here with monopolistic competition. All right. So monopolistically competitive firms, here again are their characteristics. So they have a differentiated product. It's not entirely homogeneous with every other good in the market, and it's not entirely different. Some people consider it the same as all the other goods, and some people consider it very different. They're kind of in this middle case. They have some market power. For people who consider their good not to have many substitutes, they have market power over those sorts of consumers. They use profit maximizing rules of marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Always firms set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. They charge a price based on the demand curve, just like a monopoly firm did. And it's a point where price is above marginal cost. but their long-run profits are going to depend on firm entry. If there's firm entry and firm exit, we're going to see that long-run profits or long-run losses disappear just like they did in the perfectly competitive market. All right, so let me show you a couple of graphs of monopolistic competition in the short run. All right, so here is going to be a profitable situation on the left and an unprofitable situation on the right. So the firm that is in the monopolistic competition on the left is going to have a profit to start with in the short run, and the one on the right is going to have a loss. So let me build this in. This is going to look just like the monopoly firm graph. So here is a demand curve. We have a marginal revenue curve that is twice as steep as the demand curve. And over on our firm that's going to start in an unprofitable situation, they also have a demand curve and a twice as steep marginal revenue curve. Next, I'm going to put in the marginal cost for the firm on the left and the average total cost also for the firm on the left. So what does this firm do? Well, the firm says, where does marginal cost equal marginal revenue? That is the quantity I want to produce. That is the same exact way that a firm in a perfectly competitive market made the decision and the way the firm in a monopoly made that decision. Firms always set quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. All right. What differs is that in a monopoly and here in monopolistic competition, they set the price according to the demand curve. Once they decide what the quantity is, the optimal quantity for them to produce, they can then go up to the demand curve and see what price the market will bear. And here it's a price of P. All right. Notice that price for this firm is above average total cost. That means that firm is going to make a profit. All right. They will make the difference, the distance between the average total cost curve and the demand curve at the quantity they're producing. That's profit per unit. They then make that times the quantity that they're producing. All right. Now let's flip over and look at a firm that may be making a loss. So here's a marginal cost curve. Here's an average total cost curve. So the firm is going to decide what quantity should I produce. Well, I should produce the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal costs. It's the same always for every firm. Okay. Then they say, well, let me now go up and decide what price should I charge. Well, I should charge a price that the market will bear for that quantity. So they go up and they read off the demand curve what the price should be. But notice for this firm, the average total cost per unit, well, average is per unit, but the average total cost for the firm is above the price. So that means they're going to be losing that amount per unit times the quantity that they produce. That is going to be their total loss. So the firm on the right here is in an unprofitable situation. Firm on the left is in a profitable situation. These are different markets. I'm just giving you both examples here at the same time. So for a moment, let's just focus here on the firm on the left, the firm that is making a profit. All right. So if there are profits in a monopolistic competition model, other firms are going to enter into this market. All right. Entry is allowed in monopolistic competition. All right. When they do that, this firm is going to have to share its customers with other firms. All right. They're going to be splitting up that pie of customers more ways, which means for this firm, and again, this is the individual firm graph. This is the individual firm's demand curve. Their demand curve for the original firm is going to fall. It's going to shift in because they have less demand for their company's goods. All right. Also, marginal revenue will fall. Marginal revenue is always twice as steep as the demand curve here. All right. So now let's draw back in those cost curves with this new lower demand and new lower marginal revenue. All right. So here's the marginal cost curve. Here's the average total cost curve. Where does the firm set quantity? Well, they set the quantity always where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. But now that's a lower quantity. All right. And they're going to go up and they're going to say, what price will the market bear? So here they find a price. And in the long run, just like it was for perfect competition, the price will equal the average total cost. Because any profits were driven out by firms entering and driving that demand curve for all the individual firms down. All right, so this is the long run steady state for monopolistic competition. All right, so the same thing would actually happen for the firm that was experiencing a loss. All right, that would mean that some firms would leave that market, which would drive demand up for that particular firm, drive marginal revenue up, and you would end up back at this same very graph. All right, so let me summarize this real quickly. So a key idea for monopolistic competition is free entry and free exit. All right, over here on the right, I have kind of the canonical long run graph for a firm in a monopolistic competition. All right, if the industry is profitable, firms enter, driving demand down. All right, if the industry is losing, then firms leave, driving demand up. All right, and so you end up at a point where price equals average total cost. Now there's no profits being made, there's no losses being incurred, and so this is where you get to the long run steady state of the monopolistic competition model. All right. So what is the relationship between price, marginal cost, and the long run average cost? All right. Well, so you got to think of something called markup. So markup for a firm is the difference between the price and the marginal cost. All right. Markup is possible when a firm has some market power and they sell a differentiated product. All right. This results in consumers paying more than the marginal cost. This is why monopolistic competition is different from the market of perfect competition. All right. So the more differentiated a product is, usually the higher the markup is for that product. All right. So here are two different market structures. All right. So on the left, this is monopolistic competition. On the right, we're going to have our perfectly competitive market. I want to put these two together for you here toward the end of this screencast so you can kind of see what the differences are. All right. So here's that long run steady state for the monopolistic competition. We have price equals average total cost, but marginal revenue is not a flat line. It's the twice as steep rule, and the firm is setting quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Just to remind you, in the monopolistic competition, here we have the individual firm's demand and their marginal revenue is a flat line. This firm on the right, the competitive market firm, they can sell as much as they want at the market price because their amount of selling doesn't affect the price. So they face a flat short run. They face a flat demand curve for the individual firm. It's also the same as their marginal revenue. It's also the same as price, average total cost. All of that is the same. So the firm is going to set the quantity at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. Always firms do that. And the price they charge, well, they don't get to pick. It's set by the market. All right. So you can see the difference between those two markets there with the last graph there. And so if we wanted to look back over at the monopolistic competition and say, what would efficiency look like? What would the perfectly competitive outcome look like? That's what I've drawn here at the very end. That's what would be efficient. That's where we would be at the minimum of the average total cost curve. And that was one of the results of a perfectly competitive market being efficient. We ended up where the average total cost was the minimum. The quantity being produced was at the minimum of that by the firm. We don't end up in that spot for the monopolistic competition model for the firm. All right. So the difference between the quantity that the firm does produce and what it would produce under a perfectly competitive market is something known as excess capacity. They could produce this. They could produce it at a lower average total cost per unit, but they don't because it's not the profit maximizing thing for a firm to do in a monopolistically competitive market. All right. So the difference, I started this section talking about the markup. This is where the markup comes from. At the quantity that the firm's producing, what is the difference between the marginal cost and price? That's the markup that the firm gets to charge. All right. So that's where the idea of markup comes from. So excess capacity means that the firms are relatively small and they are not producing at the output level where average total cost is minimized. All of these firms could crank up capacity if they needed to. Why don't they produce more? Because to sell more, the firm would lower its price and they would make less profit. It would be less profitable to produce that excess, all right? And we compare that to perfect competition. Perfectly competitive firms always operate at capacity and they always operate at the minimum of the average total cost curve. Overall output is higher in perfectly competitive markets than they are in monopolistically competitive markets. Again, it's kind of a middle case between monopoly and between perfect competition, all right? So what are some of the sources of inefficiency in monopolistic competition? Well, average total cost is higher than it would be in perfect competition. There's a markup that the firm gets to charge. The firm could lower the price it charges and sell more if it wanted to. Price is greater than marginal cost. That's what the markup is, after all. And if the firm tried to set price at marginal cost, the level of output sold would be where average total cost is greater than price, and the firm would be losing if they set price equal to marginal cost. So would government intervention be helpful here? Well, due to free entry, firms are not able to earn long-run profits like they are in the case of the monopolists. Regulation may put many firms out of business. Less firms may mean more inconvenience and fewer choices for consumers. And we've already seen the different problems of marginal cost pricing regulation. We've talked about it in class the other day. If the government forces firms to use marginal cost pricing and their cost structure doesn't support that sort of pricing, you can actually drive your monopolist or your monopolistically competitive firm out of business, all right? Most of the time, the inefficiency in a monopolistically competitive market is not large enough to warrant government intervention, although this varies case by case. So is the inefficiency so bad here? Well, perfect competition gives us low prices, high quantities, price equal to marginal cost at the minimum average total cost curve. So we get efficiency, but we get homogeneous products without a whole lot of variety, all right? With monopolistic competition, prices might be higher, quantities might be lower. We do get an inefficiency because price is greater than marginal cost and it's not at the minimum of the average total cost curve, but we get choice, we get variety because firms are trying to compete with one another to convince you that their product is not just like everyone else's, all right? So we do get varying degrees of product differentiation in different sort of markets. Very highly differentiated product markets mean high markups, large excess capacity, and higher prices. So in clothing, you get a lot of high differentiation between different sorts of clothing clothing stores, especially those that cater to the higher end of the market. All right. Less product differentiation when people don't really care about the differences in products. You get low markups, you get less excess capacity, and you get lower price. So you can really think of monopolistic competition as falling on a continuum between the monopoly model and the perfectly competitive model. And firms may be monopolistically competitive at different points along that continuum. All right. So this is just giving us a little graph that helps drive home the idea of differentiation, excess capacity, and efficiency, and how those relate to one another. So here, firm A is a monopolistically competitive firm that has a lot of product differentiation, and firm B is monopolistically competitive, but they have less product differentiation. All right. So here's our average total cost curves, and here is the demand curve for the firm on the left, and the quantity they're going to pick is going to be, we're kind of leaving out the marginal cost and all of that, but the quantity they're going to pick is here on the average total cost curve. Efficiency would be over here at the minimum of the average total cost curve. For the so that's their excess capacity. For the less product differentiated firm, notice that the demand curve is more elastic because it's less differentiated. People consider more things substitutes. People will switch between different products more easily. That's what less differentiation means here. So the demand curve is twisted around or spun around the average total cost curve, getting us closer to efficiency, meaning that there'll be less excess capacity in firms that are in this kind of market. So just to review, monopolistically competitive firms, what this means is it exists when many competing firms produce differentiated products. It has features of both perfect competition and monopoly, and it's closer to perfect competition than monopoly in terms of prices, output, and efficiency. And this is a very prevalent form of market throughout many economies. All right, and so that's the end of Screencast 1. We're going to have one more screencast. We're skipping oligopoly, so don't worry about that section of the chapter. And the next screencast will be about advertising and price discrimination.